What's your name?
Darcy.
Darcy.
Don't worry about it, I'll introduce myself.
Okay.
I'm not shy. My name is Darcy Thompson, and I'm from Osceola. And about 2 years ago, about 20 years ago, I got very interested in quilting and making quilts. I had little babies. Now I have great big 6-foot-tall young men, and I'm still quilting. And 2 years ago, my youngest son was in the 5th grade, and I was sitting reading a quilting magazine one morning. And in that magazine was an article on how quilts could have been used to help slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. Very interesting. He came up to me and said, "Mom, I got to tell you about something we're talking about at school." I'm not kidding you, this really happened. He came up and said, we're talking about the Civil War, and did you know that sometimes they use quilts to help slaves escape? And I thought, ooh, this is an omen, we need to do something about this. And so I had this thought, I could make each a quilt sampler, and each block would talk a little bit about this process that they took. Well, that was such a good idea. And that's all that happened with it. And then last summer, I was at a large quilt show in Minnesota, in St. Paul, and I found a book. And it was this is the book, and here it was. Underground Railroad Sampler. Here were all the patterns. It was all laid out in book form. It was ready for me to go. And I thought, okay, now it's time. Now this has to be done. And so it's been really fun. I've learned about Civil War fabrics, what they looked like. Most of the quilts you'll see tonight are made from reproduction Civil War fabrics. So you'll see what women would have made, what colors they would have used, what would have been available to them back then. I've learned a lot about that whole process, and I've also come to a great appreciation for those people who were there to help the slaves. I think the most important thing I personally have taken from this is, where am I and where are you? Would you have been willing to put yourself in your home in that position to help someone? I wish I could say, yes, sign me up, I'm the first one. But when I think about what was at stake, my family, my home, my life, there's a lot of reservations that come up. And I'm sad that that's the way it is. But we all have a need to protect ours. And so I really believe that abolitionists really gave them something really special of themselves to help these people. So here's where this whole talk comes from. It's from a book called Hidden in Plain View. And it's actually a family story of a lady called Ozella McDaniel Williams. And her relatives were actually slaves. And this is the story that they told that was used to give a directive to other slaves in how to escape. And it went like this. The monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada. With help from Jesus the carpenter, follow the bear's trail through the woods. Fill your baskets with food and supplies enough to get you to the crossroads. Once you get to the crossroads, dig a log cabin in the ground. Shoo Fly told us to dress up in cotton satin bow ties. Follow the flying geese and the birds in the air, stay on the drunkard's path. Take the sailboat across the Great Lakes toward the North Star above Canada. Okay, you got it? It kind of sounds like a jumble, doesn't it? But as I show you the quilt sampler, I think it'll explain it to you. Okay. So, the first block in the sampler over here is called the Jacob's Ladder block. And we've all heard of Jacob's Ladder, correct, from the Old Testament? Jacob's Ladder block was a symbol of the Underground Railroad. And what was the Underground Railroad? There's a little story, and it goes like this. A man was chasing his slave when it appeared that the slave had disappeared onto an underground railroad. And that's where the term comes from. What was the Underground Railroad? It was a system of people set up to help the slave escape. They were Quakers, they were Native Americans, they were white people, they were, I want to say Mormons, and that's just not the word. Masons, that's what I'm looking for. There were a lot of different people from a lot of different walks that helped. An escapee was known as a passenger. A safe house was a station. And those who helped them were known as conductors. A famous conductor on the Underground Railroad was known as Moses. Do you know who she was? Harriet Tubman, I heard it, yes. She made 19 trips back to the South to bring 300 slaves to freedom. A very dangerous endeavor. She often used a song to signal a warning or signal safety to a slave as they hid in the wilderness. It's estimated that 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. That's a good number of people. Okay, the next block is called the monkey wrench block. Now, isn't that an interesting word? I'm going to stop right here. I need a couple people with help. Would you two help hold folks? Okay, and actually I'm going to have you pick up a basket. And why don't you come on over here? We should have gotten set up like this before. And I'll have you hold this quilt, okay? The monkey wrench. What was the monkey wrench? A funny word, but I bet you guys know what this is, right? Sometimes known as a monkey wrench, right? Okay. There you go. Anyway, that one can go anyway. The monkey wrench block, if they had hung it out on a fence, was a directive to prepare your tools. Okay? Remember? Physical tools as well as mental tools. They maybe needed some physical tools because they for protection, right? They maybe would have needed to build a shelter of some type, so they needed to think about what they might be needing as far as tools. The other type of tools that they needed were mental tools, discernment, knowledge, cunning, many, many things they needed to be prepared for this long journey that they would take. Now, there's a famous abolitionist called Frederick Douglass. I'm sure you've heard of him. And he was known as Monkey Wrench. And the monkey wrench in the African Social Society was a caravan leader. And so he was known as Monkey Wrench because we also know that he helped many, many slaves escape to freedom. And it's said that after he died in his house, a monkey wrench quilt was found. Interesting, huh? Okay, thank you. And you can just fold them and toss them on the floor aside. I have a husband, 3 sons, and a male cat. Quilts are all over our house. Okay, so it goes. The monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada. The wagon wheel block was a symbol of God's protection. God is watching over us. It was also a symbol of the African life cycle: birth, life, death, and rebirth. It was also a physical directive that you might escape in a wagon. Think about swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home, right? It might have meant a wagon. You would hide in a wagon. So it was not only a symbol of God's protection, but maybe a symbol that you're going to get into a wagon. You're going to hide, and that would be a way to escape. The next block is called the carpenter's wheel. Always been one of my favorite blocks. I've always wanted to make a full quilt out of that block because my dad's a carpenter. It's probably the most difficult block to make on the whole sampler, so maybe someday. And again, the directive goes with help from Jesus the carpenter. And that, again, talks about God's protection. God is with you. All right, the next block is called the bear's paw block. And let's think about that for a minute. I'm going to have you take the next one out. If you were a slave on a plantation, you might know the borders, the boundaries of that plantation. Most likely you would have not gone much past the boundaries. It's known that the blacksmith on the plantation was often lent out to other plantations, and so he was important in gathering information, but very few slaves left their one physical plantation. Okay, now they were directed to follow the bear's trail through the woods. Okay, number one, what's a bear? Right? They're in the south, they're on a plantation. And then you're supposed to follow this little, looks kind of like that. It was important that they went through the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians were a natural barrier between the northern free states and the southern slave states. So they needed some symbols, some signs to follow. They would be leaving in the spring. And what does that bear do in the spring? He wakes up, right? And how is that bear feeling when he wakes up?
Hungry.
You got it. What's he looking for? Berries, fish, water. So that gave them food, water, supplied something they needed to get through those mountains. So this quilt is my mama bears and baby bears. See the little bears and the big bears? When I go on a trip, when my family goes on a trip, we pack the minivan, we put the carrier on top, we fill it with all kinds of stuff, and then we go on a 6-hour trip, right? Isn't that the way it goes? And then we have this really neat digital compass that we can follow, and if we really want to know where we're going, we can bring the GPS. Okay? So we can, or we could get on MapQuest. We have all kinds of neat ways to help us get where we're going. Can you imagine being told this is what you do? You head north and you follow a track of a bear. We're right back here, aren't we? God is protecting you. God is watching over you. You really have to believe there had to be some faith there. All right, fill your baskets with food and supplies. The basket block was the next instruction. And again, let's go back to my minivan. The cooler, the suitcases, all that stuff that we pack to go. Okay, they were escaping probably by night a lot of times, on the run, and you needed to bring supplies for a long journey. Maybe this is how you were going to carry it. Because you'd be on the run. Or maybe a small bag. This is probably, I don't know if I'd want to run by night carrying this in the dark. So, they needed to rely on someone for help. And that's where the abolitionists come in. There you go. Well, now we got to get it going the right way. There you go. And when I made this quilt, I was really thinking of the abolitionist woman, because I think she was really, really important. I have to believe she was important in this whole undertaking. Because, now look at this, if I were an abolitionist woman, most likely, if I were a woman in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, I probably would not be working out of the home. I would have been at home. My duties would have been to cook, to clean, to laundry, to sew, and I would go about my daily business, and carrying a basket like this would not be unusual at all, would it? This would be very normal for me to walk around like this. Can you see what I've got down in the bottom of the basket? What's in there? Do you have an idea? Yes. You can't tell, can you? So she would have been hiding all kinds of things in here, going upstairs, going downstairs, going out to the barn, going here, going there. She could go all over the place with supplies. she was mending, she was cooking. She wouldn't have been suspicious in the normal, everything day things that she did. And she could have been very integral in helping those slaves. Don't you think? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, if you'll allow me a moment, I'm going to flip this up so you can see better.
Darcy, when the slaves would be going through the woods, through the trails at night, they would be seeing those quilts hanging out, and that's where they got help?
This would have been their instruction before they left. And the story of this family is that her great-grandmother and grandfather, her grandfather was actually a blacksmith, and he was a minister. And he was allowed to go from plantation to plantation. And her great-grandmother, I believe it was brought the quilt, which told the stories and passed the information. So as these different, it probably wouldn't have been in a sampler. It would have been the individual quilts like this. So when when one of those quilts was laid out on the line, they knew that was time to do that. When the monkey wrench was put out, it was time to get those supplies ready. It was time to take care of those different things. It was a way of telling the story. Because remember, they couldn't read and write. It was illegal for a slave to read and write. Okay? So they had to use other ways to tell it. We know that they used spirituals. We know that they used singing as a way to communicate information. So the quilts were another way to communicate the information. Good question. Okay. Fill your baskets with food and supplies enough to get you to the crossroads. What was the crossroads? The crossroads were actually several physical places. One was Cleveland, Ohio, and another one was Detroit, Michigan. And it was important to get to those places, and then they would proceed from there into Canada. Now, the thing that made this really important was called the Fugitive Slave Act, which came with the Compromise of 1850. And prior to that time, a black person could be once they got to the north, they were free. They were in a free state and they could live and be free. But after that Fugitive Slave Act, they couldn't just be in the north, because after that time, any black person could be brought back to the southern states and back to slavery. So it was important that they got to these ports and got into Canada. So the next quilt is the Crossroads quilt. Now, we're going to break from the Civil War fabrics here for a minute, so don't anybody fall out of your chair. I purposely chose to make this quilt. I have a son who graduated from high school this past Friday, and I chose this block for him because I really felt like that was he had reached a crossroads in his life. He was moving on to phase 2, basically. He was ending his childhood at home with us, and now it was moving on to the next phase. He'd reached a crossroads, and it was time to step over. You know what a crossroads is in the country? When you know what that is, right? Okay, so you come to that crossroads, and you got a choice, right? You can go this way, you can go this way, you can go back, or you can proceed forward. And when you move into the crossroads, that means you maybe will be leaving something behind, okay? And most likely you will be leaving something behind. As a child graduating from high school, he's leaving his little boyhood behind him. Boy, has that made me sad the last few weeks. But the best part of it is he's moving into his manhood. And as a slave, once they reached that crossroads, we would think, well, of course they wanted to move to the next phase. That's what they left for, right? But think about what they would be leaving behind. Family. Maybe their child had been sold to a different plantation. They'd never see them again. so that was a hard thing. That was a hard decision to be made, I believe. There's also information that a special place in Cleveland, Ohio, may have been known as the Crossroads, and that was Hope Church. There was a church that helped many, many slaves. It's well known. It was called Hope Church, and that was called the Crossroads as well. Thank you. I love it when I show this quilt at a school group because I get to that bright one and all the kids, oh, I love the bright one. Okay, once you get to the Crossroads, dig a log cabin in the ground. Okay, again, here I believe is a directive to make that decision that this is your life now. There's no turning back. You will have to leave the past behind. Make this your home. Dig a log cabin. Again, then maybe too, they're talking about that Hope Church. Maybe they're talking about a physical log cabin that you got to. I think a lot of the blocks had dual meanings, or even more than two meanings. An interesting part about the log cabin quilt is that you would usually find it with a red center. Does anyone have antique quilts?
I have one with a red center.
You have one with a red center? Okay, how about you?
And it doesn't go with the rest of the colors at all. It looks really strange, so it's on my husband's bed, not mine.
Do you know what that red center meant?
No, I had no
No,
idea.
it means it's a symbol of hearth and home. And that's why red was used. Somebody else raised their hand. Antique log cabin.
I've made them myself.
Okay, so yes, okay. I think specifically when we talk about antiques, we're going to mostly find the red. The black was a symbol of a safe house. And I always say at this point, now if you find a black centered log cabin quilt in an antique store, you just pick it right up and bring it on over to my house, okay? Now this would be an instance where an abolitionist would have put that quilt out on the clothesline to say, this is the place, come here, this is a safe house. Now another center may have been yellow, and that was a symbol of a light shining in the wilderness. So hearth and home, which yours is, so now maybe you'll love that quilt more. Huh?
Yeah. It really isn't an antique one.
It isn't?
No,
Okay.
I know who made it, but it's not antique.
Okay, but they still,
But it was the
Red
red
with the
center
red,
that
isn't
doesn't go good with any of the other
but they
colors.
knew that had to be red. Okay, so the next block is called the shoe fly block. Who or what was a shoe fly? You've heard that little song, right? Shoe fly. That's what most of us know about shoe fly, right? Or shoe fly pie and apple pan dowdy. You know that one too, right? Those were later. Shoe fly was actually a name for someone who would be there to help them. And it says, shoe fly told us to dress up in cotton and satin bow ties. So shoe fly was there to tell them, this is where you go, this is what you need to do now, once you've got to the crossroads. The bow tie blocks, the cotton and satin bow ties, was important. A slave on the plantation probably would have worn homespun their clothes would have been made out of a homespun type of fabric. Many plantations had a loom house, and the fabric was woven right there. And so this fabric would have been a rougher, more coarsely woven fabric. And so, number one, the fabric that their clothes were made of would have been different from what someone in the northern states would have been wearing. The other thing we need to think about is, they were on the run. They really were going through the wilderness, on the run. And so imagine what their clothes looked like at that time. Probably need a fresh pair of clothes, right? And they weren't just going to run down to the general store and pick up some clothes. So they needed that shoe fly to help them, to tell them what to do. A man slave was known as hardware. A woman slave was known as dry goods. And often a woman would have worn something like this, right? Back in those days. This bonnet would have been very good for keeping the sun out. And if she would have really dressed, she probably would have had gloves on. She would have had a long skirt, maybe a shawl, and she could have really covered up, right? There's a story about a minister in Nebraska City, Nebraska, who would go out with 2 bonneted women in his wagon, and he would come back with 2 other bonneted women in his wagon. Were they women? What color was their skin? Good thoughts, huh? Many, many different ways that slaves were hidden. Okay, the other thing that I think is interesting about this block, this bow tie block, is that if you look at it this way, it looks like an hourglass, doesn't it? And the African symbol of an hourglass meant time well spent or time among friends. Isn't that neat? It makes me want to make an hourglass quilt. Give it to a friend. Okay, the next block is called the flying geese. You can pull up that little one there. Now, when they were leaving, we already said they would leave in the springtime, right? And we're in springtime here right now. And as I'm out running in the morning, I often hear honk, 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 right? You know, especially in the early morning, you really hear that. So not only could they visually watch the geese and follow them, but they could hear them. It was an auditory sign as well. That quilt also could have pointed the direction to go. Look at how I've put 2 going this way and 1 going this way. Maybe this one points to something that was to give us, maybe it would point to a safe house. It would point to, this is somewhere you need to come. Isn't that a symbol? So, follow the flying geese and the birds in the air. Again, another block, another quilt that shows direction. There's the birds in the air. If you look at those triangles, they could give that, you can just put it, you can just turn it any which way you want, because any way you turn those triangles, they're going to show direction, aren't they? Just like the geese fly in a V toward the north. So we could point those triangles toward the north, or we could point that to my house. I could have that on my clothesline and point it toward my house. Come here. I'm a safe place for you. Put a lantern in my window that night. Thank you. Okay, so the quilt code said, follow the flying geese, the birds in the air, and stay on the drunkard's path. Now, when I get to this point, when I do it with children, I always have some little boy come up and walk like a drunkard. So, who wants to do that? You know what I mean, though? A drunkard's path would not be a straight line, right? Most likely, they would be on a curving path. And so this block is not made of straight lines. It's made of curved pieces. And so it gives the appearance of meandering around. And that was really important because often slaves were tracked by dogs. So they needed to not follow a straight line. They often needed to double back. They needed to go through the rivers, the streams, to throw the scent off. So that was an important direction for them. Okay, so stay on the drunkard's path and take the sailboat across the Great Lakes toward the North Star above Canada. All right, there's again where we reference back to that Fugitive Slave Act, where they needed to get to Canada. So they would cross Lake Erie. The docks and the ports at Cleveland, at Detroit were important for them because they could get onto a boat. Often they were black dock workers, black workers on ships that would aid them in getting where they needed to go. Black abolitionists that were ship owners would help them to get on those ships and get across where they needed to be. The last block is the North Star block. And this is a sign of the Big Dipper. The North Star is in the handle of the Big Dipper, which point, okay, let me say it right out. The Little Dipper, who knows their astrology? I always say this wrong. It's in the handle of the Little Dipper points to the Big Dipper, and the North Star is in the handle of the Big Dipper, right? Okay, good. So they would watch the constellations to help them get to the north. And again, they needed to get to Canada for that North Star. It's an interesting, fun story, isn't it? Is it true? We don't know that. I know. What a way to give a talk, right? No. The truth is, it's a great story. If you go on the internet, you're going to find a lot of controversy. And they're saying it's not true, whatever. Let's bring it back to that original point. We know that many slaves escaped to freedom, right? We know that is a fact. We know that many, many people helped them. We know that there was a war fought. We know that many people gave their lives in that war. And we do know that slavery ended, right? We also know that in the 1960s, Dr. Martin Luther said that, Martin Luther King, and what did he say? What were his famous words? I have a dream. That's right. So, 150 years later, we're still looking to end segregation. This year, January of this year, President Bush said that all men have a right to freedom. We're still looking for freedom in this world. So, where do we fall into that? Would you be one of those people that helped? Would you harbor them even if you knew that if you were found out, it would be very dangerous? You could not tell your family, you could not tell your neighbors. It had to be kept secret. I don't know. Where would I be in that whole story? I don't know. I gave this talk and the pastor said, well, I've got this troubled mom. Would you take her in? A pregnant woman, troubled woman. Life is pretty comfortable at my house. I don't know. So that's what this has all come down to me. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. We know the facts, right? We do know those facts. This became more of a passion with me than just making quilts, because I've been making quilts for 40 years, and that's a pretty strong passion. But this became even more in that I wanted this to be something that would help somebody somehow. And so I've been asking a donation for the Battered Women's Shelter, and it's gone very well, and I'm very happy about that. So, the CRA, so Community Referral Agency. I forget to say that, and then people say, well, what's CRA? So, that's where it's been for me. I hope you found it interesting, entertaining, maybe informative. And I have one more quilt to show you. This is my log cabin quilt, the symbol of a safe house. It's one of my favorites. So next time you see a quilt, look a little deeper. Thank you.
What was the penalty if you got caught harboring somebody?
I think maybe the strongest penalty is that you were shunned in your community. So people wouldn't want to trade with you. They wouldn't want to, a lot of them were farmers. And your community wouldn't want anything to do with you. I think maybe that was the hardest thing for a lot of people to deal with.
Conductors could have been killed.
Yes.
They would have been shot. They're hung.